On my final day as a nurse, after nearly 40 years, I expected to quietly turn in my badge and walk away. Instead, strangers began arriving at the hospital one by one. As they shared stories I had completely forgotten, God revealed something that changed the way I would see my entire life forever.
Welcome back to God Showed Up Stories. Some people spend their lives changing the world without ever realizing it. Not because they become famous, not because they receive awards, but because they faithfully show kindness, compassion, and love in ordinary moments. Teachers, parents, caregivers, volunteers, nurses. Many of them go home each day wondering if anything they did truly mattered. They rarely get to see how their small acts of kindness continue living in someone else's story. Maybe you've felt that way too. Maybe you've wondered if the sacrifices you made, the long hours, the quiet prayers, the encouragement you offered, actually made a difference. The beautiful truth is this: God often allows us to plant seeds that will bloom in lives we'll never fully see. Sometimes the greatest impact we make is invisible to us, but unforgettable to someone else. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone whose quiet kindness has made a difference in your life. And comment below. Kindness always leaves a legacy. Never underestimate what God can do through one ordinary life that chooses to love others well. All right, let's get into the story.
People often told me nursing was a calling. When I was 22 years old, I wasn't sure I believed that. I simply wanted to help people. I never imagined I'd spend nearly 40 years walking the halls of the same hospital. My career became measured in moments, not promotions, not titles, moments. Holding the hand of a frightened patient before surgery, rocking a newborn in the neonatal unit while exhausted parents finally got an hour of sleep, sitting quietly beside someone who didn't want to face their final moments alone. There were nights I cried all the way home. There were Christmas mornings spent in hospital rooms instead of around my own family table. Birthdays I missed. School plays I arrived late for. My husband never complained. Neither did our children. They understood that sometimes other families needed me too. Still, there were moments I wondered whether I had given too much of myself. Patients came, patients went. Thousands of faces, thousands of names. Some recovered beautifully, some didn't. Most disappeared from my life the moment they walked through the hospital doors. I often wondered what became of them. Did they remember the nurse who sat beside them during the hardest days of their lives? Probably not. As retirement approached, that question lingered in my heart more than I wanted to admit. Had my life really mattered? Or had I simply spent 4 decades doing a job that would quickly be forgotten? On the morning of my final shift, I walked through the hospital entrance, carrying the same lunch bag I'd used for years. Everything looked familiar. The smell of fresh coffee, the sound of monitors, the laughter at the nurse's station, even the squeak of my shoes against the hallway floor. Several coworkers hugged me. Others joked that I'd be back within a month because retirement would be too boring. I laughed with them, but inside, I felt strangely empty. Throughout the morning, I visited patients one last time, checked medications, answered questions, held hands, just as I always had. Around lunchtime, one of the receptionists called upstairs. "Margaret, there's someone here asking for you." I frowned. "For me?" She smiled. "I think you'll want to come down." When I stepped into the hospital lobby, I saw a young woman standing beside a tall teenage boy. The moment she saw me, tears filled her eyes. She walked over and wrapped me in a hug. "You probably don't remember us," she said. I smiled apologetically. "I'm so sorry. I wish I could." She gently placed her hand on the young man's shoulder. "This is Ethan. You stayed beside him night after night when he was born almost 3 months early. You kept telling me not to lose hope. I don't think I could have made it without you." She looked proudly at her son. He just earned a scholarship. I stared at the young man, healthy, strong, smiling. My eyes filled with tears. "I remember praying for a tiny little baby," I whispered. "I never imagined I'd meet the man he would become." Before I could gather my thoughts, another visitor walked through the front doors. An elderly gentleman slowly approached me holding a worn photograph. "I've carried this picture in my wallet for 14 years, he said. He handed it to me. It showed me sitting beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of a woman whose face looked peaceful, despite her illness. "My wife," he said softly. "That was the last night of her life. I'll never forget the kindness you showed us." I looked closely at the photograph. I remembered her face. I remembered praying with them, but I had no idea anyone had taken that picture. As the afternoon continued, more visitors arrived, one after another, each carrying a story, each remembering moments I had long forgotten. With every conversation, I began realizing something extraordinary. The moments that had seemed ordinary to me had become unforgettable to someone else, and the day was only beginning. By late afternoon, the hospital lobby looked more like a family reunion than a retirement celebration. People continued arriving. Some carried flowers, others brought handwritten cards. But what overwhelmed me most were the stories. A man in his 40s stepped forward, holding a small notebook. "I don't know if you remember me," he said. "I was admitted here 12 years ago." He hesitated before continuing. "I wasn't here because I was physically sick. I had reached one of the darkest moments of my life. I had lost my job. My marriage was falling apart. I honestly didn't believe life was worth living anymore. I quietly listened. I'll never forget one night when you sat beside my bed after your shift had ended. You probably thought it was just a conversation, but you looked at me and said, 'This chapter is not the end of your story. Don't give up before you see what God still has planned for you.'" He smiled through tears. The next morning, I agreed to get the help I needed. He reached into his wallet and showed me a family photo. Today, I'm a husband again, a father, and I've been helping others who struggle with depression. I came here because I wanted you to know your words saved my life. I stood speechless. I had no memory of saying those exact words, but he had carried them with him for over a decade. A little later, one of the hospital volunteers approached me. "There are a few more people waiting." I laughed softly. "How is this possible?" She smiled. "Kindness has a longer memory than we realize." As evening approached, the hospital staff gathered for a small retirement reception. There were hugs, laughter, a few tears. But the greatest gift wasn't the cake or the speeches. It was finally understanding something I had questioned for years. My life had mattered, not because I had done anything extraordinary, but because God had used ordinary moments of compassion to touch people in ways I never knew. Several days later, I drove to a quiet lake not far from home. Retirement felt strange. For the first time in decades, there was nowhere I needed to be. I sat on a weathered bench watching the sunlight dance across the water. An older woman carrying a thermos smiled as she walked past. "Mind if I sit for a while?" "Of course," I replied. We introduced ourselves. When I mentioned I had just retired after nearly 40 years as a nurse, she smiled knowingly. So did I. We both laughed. Then she asked the question I'd been carrying in my heart. "Are you wondering whether your work really made a difference?" I looked at her in surprise. "How did you know?" "Because I asked myself the same thing." She gazed across the lake before quietly, saying, "When I retired, I thought my purpose had ended. But one day I realized something. We spend our lives planting seeds. Most of them bloom in places we'll never see." She turned toward me, the patient who smiled because you held their hand, the family who found strength because you stayed a little longer, the frightened child who felt safe because you spoke gently. Those moments don't disappear. They continue growing long after we've forgotten them. Her words settled deep within my heart. For the first time, I stopped measuring my life by what I remembered. Instead, I began trusting God with everything I would never know. Over the following months, retirement became something beautiful. I began volunteering at a local hospice. I mentored young nurses just beginning their careers. Whenever one of them wondered if the long hours and quiet sacrifices were worth it, I smiled and shared what I had learned. You may never see the harvest, but don't stop planting seeds. Looking back now, I don't believe God showed up through a grand retirement celebration. He showed up through grateful patience, a faded photograph, a simple conversation beside a peaceful lake, and the quiet reminder that love offered in ordinary moments is never wasted. Today, I no longer wonder if my life mattered, because I've learned that God's greatest work through us often happens quietly, without applause, without recognition, and sometimes without us ever knowing. Yet heaven keeps the record, and that is more than enough. If this story touched your heart, comment below. Kindness always leaves a legacy. Maybe you've been wondering if your quiet acts of love have made a difference. Maybe you've cared for others, encouraged someone, or simply been there when they needed you. Never believe those moments were wasted. God sees every seed you plant, and in His perfect timing, those seeds will bloom, often in ways you'll never fully know. If this story encouraged you, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment below, subscribe to God Showed Up Stories, share this story with a nurse, caregiver, teacher, volunteer, or anyone who faithfully serves others behind the scenes. Thank you for spending this time with us, and always remember, God always shows up right on time.